Hi, and welcome to the Psych, Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm glad to be back in the office, Jason.
Yeah, we've missed you the last couple of days.
Yep, working from home the last couple of days. We had some people come to help us unpack some of the many boxes that have finally been returned to our home. So there's still boxes left to unpack because it's just stuff that we have to decide what are we going to keep and what are we going to ditch, and that's not really a decision that removalists can make on our behalf.
They probably could, but you probably don't want them to.
No.
Yeah, I would have thought in the constant state of moving in and out of apartments and temporary accommodation that you would have gotten rid of all the clutter already.
Well, what happened was that they actually just came in and boxed up everything and took it away as sort of part of the insurance process. So we just sort of packed the clothes and things that we needed and, got out of Dodge. And then, everything else just got packed up and stored. So we haven't actually been through that sort of packing and unpacking process, really.
Yeah, I think if we go back to episode 1 of the podcast way back in February, I think we're still talking about you moving and insurance. And
so this happened in November last year. And so, when I joined in February, we were in temporary accommodation at that time. So those first podcasts that we recorded while we were in lockdown, that was from the temporary accommodation that I was in.
Yeah. So we're just talking to our guest off air that, we felt bad because she was in lockdown and we've had relative freedom, but you haven't had it all easy, have you, Joelle?
I haven't. No, I've had a bit of a terrible year, really. Yeah.
Except for working at PDX.
Sure.
Well, that's good enough for me. Let's move on before she says anything else. I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Very excited to have her. She's got a doctorate in organizational psychology and is an honorary fellow in the School of Psychology at Deakin University. She has a broad experience base across consulting, academia, and senior management, and has published over 24 empirical papers on wellbeing, stress, and mental health. She's currently the head of talent and careers at one of Australia's leading banks. Welcome to the podcast, Dr Kathryn Page.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Tony LaMontagne talks very highly of you. So we thought we really need to get this person on the podcast. So it's really great that we've been able to line you up.
He's a very hard act to follow, though. I was just reflecting on the conversation you had with him. And he obviously, being a very esteemed professor, is more 250 plus publications. But we followed a very different path.
Yeah, clearly you've definitely gone more down the consulting and practical route versus the academic. Yeah, no, when I mentioned to Laura Kirby that she'd be following Tony's episode, she was a bit mortified herself. At least you've got a few podcast episodes in between.
Laura's also someone to look up to.
Yeah, no, she's terrific in her own right as well. Absolutely. We only get good guests on here, Kat. You're in good company.
It's the only reason I've decided to join.
Glad to have you.
All right, Kat, can you tell us what podcasts you like to listen to?
Well, obviously, I now listen to this podcast, which I hope is the right answer. No, in all seriousness, just came across a podcast recently and have been really enjoying the information that you're putting out there and love the cause. The other podcast I listen to will probably tell you a little bit about my interests at the moment. So one of them is a Future Women Leadership series. So I love hearing about what women are doing in the workplace and tips and tricks around particularly being a female leader in the workplace. There's another one that I love called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. So that's by a guy in the UK, Bruce Daisley, who used to be the VP of Twitter. So quite a big deal. He's since written a book, actually. So he has a really interesting podcast as well. And then I also listened to a bit of a nerdy one, which is called All in the Mind, which is an ABC podcast.
We do like a bit of nerdy content here, don't we?
Yeah. I'd say the majority of mine are probably, more nerdy. Only really Hamish and Andy have I got for some kind of comedy respite.
You do need some light listening at times.
You do. Yeah, you do. I'm listening to The Sandman on audiobook at the moment, which is a completely different thing altogether. So listeners who know what that is will know what I'm talking about, and everybody else will just do like Jason does and smile politely.
Yeah. Does it have time travel in it? Because I know you like that.
Well, it's about the Sandman, so like the dream.
Yeah. Okay.
As a being, I guess, and his adventures through history.
Okay.
I'm hearing a song now.
Yeah. I've got it in my head.
Is that what you've got as well? Yeah.
That anthropomorphic personification. Yes.
Jeepers, how did you say that?
I read a lot of Terry Pratchett as well.
I wouldn't mind actually hearing you hum a few bars, Jason, perhaps, of the song you've got in your head. Just to check it's the same. No.
I can't carry a tune to save my life.
There are a few different songs about that person. So my assumption is Jason's is the Metallica version.
No, it wasn't actually.
It wasn't. No, it was
something a lot more camp. Yeah,
yeah, that's what I've got. The one that I've got is quite boppy.
Okay.
I think there might be an a cappella or something.
Dun, 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 dun,
yes.
dun, 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 dun.
Oh, you can carry a tune. Listen here. Show off.
All right, Kat, can you tell us about your professional career then, please?
Sure. Very simple question, but there is lots to talk about there. So when I think about my career, I've sort of had 3 chapters, if you like. So I haven't stuck just to academia. I did start off in academia, so spent about 10 years working in research, which is where I did my postdoc with Tony, which is how we came across each other. But I've also spent many, many years in leadership consulting. So most recently spent about 5 years working for Deloitte and worked my way up to a director in that organisation, and also spent 2 years living and working in London, which was one of the best things I'd ever done from a life perspective, but also from a career, just to get that broader perspective. And then more recently, my third chapter, if consulting's the second chapter, the third chapter has been more in internal roles. So I did very briefly move into sport. So I was the head of inclusion and wellbeing for a period of time at Tennis Australia. And then more recently, working in the banking sector in a talent and leadership role.
Fantastic. It's that's a great variety there, and I like how you've broken it into chapters. The sports area is one that's been getting a lot of prominence lately. Athletes sort of making decisions in relation to their mental health, and it's been quite interesting to see how that's played out in the media. So that's an area that we've been watching with interest, and I think athletes have a way of shaping conversation in a way that a lot of other people don't. So it's good to see them taking some leadership in that area.
Absolutely. Which
is part of the reason why I was so excited to make a side move into that, because I have no background whatsoever in sport, but obviously strong background in wellbeing. But I think that that sport does provide such a huge stage to talk about public and social issues like mental health, and they can really do so much good in that regard, in a similar way that when senior leaders, any public figure really comes forward and talks about struggles with mental health, and particularly in sport, the link between mental health and performance, which you actually can measure quite a lot more with a lot more ease than perhaps you can in corporate life, but it can do quite a lot of good and really get discourse going on the topic, which is important.
Mm.
Yeah. Now you wear a number of hats, don't you, Kat?
I do. Yes.
So one of those.
I like to have a lot of hats.
Yeah, I like to spread myself around a few different areas of the business. I can't really focus outside of the business at the moment. But one of your hats is Honorary Fellow at Deakin University in the School of Psychology there. Can you tell us a bit about some of your research that you've done previously and currently in the area of workplace mental health?
Absolutely. So I really started my career in research, and I was really lucky to start studying the topic of workplace wellbeing way back in 2005, where there wasn't a whole lot of research, to be honest, being done on this topic. But I was working with a professor called Bob Cummins, who was at the time, and maybe he still is, was considered one of the fathers of wellbeing, particularly in Australia. He did the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index, which you might have heard of. But I was interested in looking at quality of work life and workplace wellbeing and what that actually means and how you define it. And I think since then I have held the same conceptualization, which is that it's about three things. Jason, you'll love this being an ex-consultant as well, 3 C's, that it's about competence, or having an opportunity to feel competent, that you've got a sense of mastery and skills, connection, so that might be connection to others, but also connection to a higher purpose, if you like, or to meaning, and then also control, which is obviously autonomy. So that was in 2005. Post that, I went into doing my doctorate in organisational psychology, still absolutely loved the whole topic of wellbeing, but was more interested now in designing interventions to increase happiness and wellbeing in the workplace. And this was around the time that positive psychology was having its big boom. And so the way that I designed those interventions was very much with a positive strength-based approach. And being an org psych student, the thing I loved most was being able to actually design and then deliver that intervention myself. It was a really, really great 6 weeks where I delivered that intervention, but probably not surprising to you nor your listeners, the effect of those interventions was positive, but it did start to wear off after around the 6-month mark. So usually when they start to, or when they stop applying those strategies. So after my doctorate, I spent a year doing some consulting projects. One of them was at WorkSafe. So I was working with their head of wellbeing at the time to help to bring more of that positive psychology approach into their workplace wellbeing program. And that was where I met Tony. So meeting Tony was a bit like meeting a celebrity. So being a nerd, and a professional nerd as I am, I do tend to worship at the feet of academics. And when you've cited somebody's work and read their work and then actually meet them in person, elbow patches and all, I was very excited.
Yeah, Joelle's got a term for this. Probably not something we should repeat.
I don't think we should share that term.
Maybe you could just write it on a piece of paper and show me.
We record this over video as well. We'll tell you after.
I'll tell you after. Yeah, listeners, if you'd like to know, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Is it a derogatory word?
It's
it's just a bit crude.
Yeah,
okay, that's fine.
But it's so Joelle.
It's a bit crude.
It's on brand. Yeah.
Well,
I've also had that experience, Katherine, meeting academics that I respect. Having these real fangirl moments and just like being equally excited and just thinking how lame I'm being. So just sort of sitting there really, really low key, but like deep down inside going, oh my goodness, I can't believe it.
It is. No, and when you go to these international conferences, like I remember I went to Rome for the first time by myself during my doctorate and was struggling. I was, for some reason, stupidly decided to wear high heels, and I was struggling up a hill in Rome. And there was this man huffing and puffing and struggling next to me. Actually, I was huffing and puffing. He was not. He was actually just striding ahead, let's be honest. And it was Michael Leiter of Burnout, Maslach and Leiter fame. And that was also a moment. He's a lovely guy as well. You should get him on here.
Okay, done.
He would be excellent. But where was I? We've gone on a slight tangent. So
we have.
Yep.
So elbow
Tony.
patches. So yes, yep. Tony and his elbow patches. So I met Tony, and he told this story as well in his podcast, but I probably told him how much I loved his work. He happened to have an NHMRC funded postdoc available, and for whatever reason, I got to do it. So I entered the world of elbow patches for real this time. So University of Melbourne in the global and public health, and spent the next 3 years or so working with Tony and people like Ange Martin to do all things work, stress and wellbeing, but in particular, the integrated approach to workplace mental health, which I'm sure we will talk about at some point. And then I guess if I was to look back on some of the research that I've done through Deakin and through Melbourne that I'm probably most proud of and probably still continue to be my interests. One is very much looking at positive mental health promotion and how we can promote the positive in workplaces. So that was my main contribution to the integrated model. And I'm getting a restart your computer, which we don't want. So that involves both promoting the positive aspects of work, so good work in that sense, but also promoting wellbeing like what I had done in my previous interventions. So I still do quite a lot of work in that space, and looking at that in particular around how that can buffer the adverse effects of the work environment, but also how we can really build up things like supervisor support and other organisational resources as well to help to prevent stress and also protect workers from mental health problems. The second area that I've spent a lot of time in is looking at leadership strategies for stress prevention. So as we were discussing when we were off air, I was really lucky to be involved in the VicPol, or the Victoria Police work, I should say, early on in my career, where we were designing a stress prevention pilot. And at that stage, we were taking very much a leadership approach. So how can we work with sergeants and senior sergeants and support them to create an environment that's more supportive? So I was really lucky enough to be designing the interventions that we were applying in those stress prevention pilots. And that is what actually formed the basis of the integrated workplace mental health strategy that we ended up using as part of the RCT work that Alicia worked on from your team after I left. So that was a really wonderful project. And then the third thing that I have worked on that I'm still really interested in is the stigma that's associated with stress. So we probably know a lot already about the stigma that's associated with mental health. I think that we're getting a lot better at that. But quite often, I think we aren't doing enough to acknowledge that actually it is a very hard thing for leaders and for people to actually come forward and talk to their workplace about experiencing stress, because it is still seen as a sign of individual weakness. And for every person who is experiencing stress, a leader might be able to point at another who is exposed to the same working conditions and perhaps not presenting with stress, which I think then starts to create this perception that it is something that's entirely within the individual's control, and that perhaps we just need to be a little bit more resilient, which is obviously not at all best practice. Best practice is to intervene in working conditions and actually address stress at their source. But I don't think a lot of organisations are still looking at stress in that more organisational sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've had a very broad, I guess, research background. So let me get this right. So the 3 C's, you're talking about self-determination theory there. You then were looking at positive psychology and strengths-based approaches. You've done a bit in the leadership space as well. And then to cap it off, you've also looked at stigma reduction and stress. Is that everything, or did I miss something?
And if you think about it, they're all part of the integrated approach. Yes. So the different pillars, which are prevent harm, promote the positive, and support workers regardless of cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love how you've spent a bit of time in the pos psych area. I was quite enamored with that for a number of years, and it is still a big part of what we do, because if we think about the integrated approach, ultimately, we talk about our product being a psych health and safety tool, but then we also use positive psychology and the PERMA model in particular in order to enhance the positive, and then using things like the VIA character strength survey to talk about strengths and help build character. One of my fanboy moments was having a selfie with Martin Seligman at Geelong Grammar at a conference, which was pretty cool. So the godfather of positive psychology for those who are unfamiliar with him. So that's quite a breadth, and I can see how it is all, like you say, aligned to the integrated model of workplace mental health, and you've kind of worked at all different levels, which is great.
Well, I've always just been fascinated with work and mental health, and I sort of found myself over that decade wanting to look at it from different perspectives. So from a legal perspective, from a positive perspective, from an intervention perspective, which is probably why my skills and my interest led itself better to application, because I think academics, to be really, really successful, they do tend to become the deepest possible experts in maybe one or two aspects, whereas I've sort of always been a bit more interested in at the multifaceted nature of things and the contextual side. And so it's almost like turning the problem around and looking at it from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, no, it's terrific that you're able to do that, and obviously that gives you a really good grounding in terms of becoming a pracademic, right? Now being able to apply all the great stuff that you've learned from your own research and that of others.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to have that that competence in research to then be able to also translate not only your own research but other research into practice in a way that's going to be effective and deliver what it's supposed to deliver. So I think having people who do have that sort of crossover of experience and skill is really important for organisations. So on top of all of that, you're also writing a book.
Yes.
Yes. Tell us about your book.
Yes. If people aren't listening, or aren't watching the video and are listening, you would have missed the fleeting look of pain and suffering that was on my face momentarily there. So this is a book that I'm doing with another celebrity, if you like, Sir Kerry Cooper, who I actually met at that same conference where I met Michael Leiter. So he is a wonderful, wonderful, brilliant man. So we're writing a book which is for leaders, which is aimed to collect, well, it's all around how leaders can create a mentally healthy workplace. That's just a working title at the moment, but the whole idea behind it was to collect real stories from leaders and from people, just everyday people who could talk about either the experience of mental health issues in the workplace or had been leaders designing and delivering interventions at large scale, as well as academics who obviously are collecting the evidence base, and to bring those to life to try to demystify some of the more practical side of workplace mental health. And it really is a passion project. So it's a labour of love, something I'm doing outside of work and on top of being a working parent. But it has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm loving getting back into that world again.
Does it have a working title yet?
Oh, it's changed. It was it probably will change again. I think at the moment it's called A World Beyond Stress. But again, working title. Watch this space.
Yeah. Do we have an ETA?
It's due to the publisher. So it's being published by Routledge and it's due to them in December. And I'm about halfway through at the moment. So I've just hit the 22,000 word mark, and I've been told I get cut off at 40,000 words. All
right.
But because they're just such fascinating stories, like I've been talking to people like Dame Carol Black, Sir Michael Marmot, the esteemed Tony, as well as everyday people, that the stories that these are generating, it's really hard to cut them down because I do think every single one of them adds such an interesting angle. I've also got some sports personalities in there like Paul Roos, which you may need to interpret for your international audience, and Alyssa Camplin, who was a Winter Olympics champion. So various people who've got a perspective on wellbeing and mental health, and bringing all of that together to show how the workplace mental health model actually applies in practice.
Yeah. So for Joelle, probably as well, Paul Roos is a legendary AFL player and coach.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had no idea who that person was. I did know who Alyssa was though.
Yeah. Okay. I figured that might be the case. Yeah.
So Paul and his wife Tammy brought mindfulness, were the first to bring mindfulness to the AFL. And what they did, which is so interesting in my mind, is create this environment and this culture that really embedded the practice. So that was a really interesting story.
Yeah, I've seen Paul present live and he's a very engaging speaker. So,
and really passionate about this topic, as is his wife.
Well, I will certainly look forward to having a look at your book when it's published. Sounds fascinating.
If it gets published, which we are hopeful. We're hopeful I will finish it.
You'll get that.
I'm certain, based on everything that you've just told us about yourself, I'm certain that you'll get it done.
One day at a time.
Some form of punishment, I reckon that would be writing a book.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
just as bad as a PhD.
It is.
Yeah, it
is.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why I've done this to myself again, because I knew how bad it was the first time. But this, I think, because it's a bit more, engaging and real world, I'm enjoying it a lot more than the PhD.
Yeah. See, Joelle and I hate writing content, which is why we prefer just to interview people and record it on a podcast. Yeah. It's so much easier.
It's much easier.
Can I just say it's such a good idea?
Yeah. So in your research and in writing your book, what views have you formed about the role of leaders in building psychological health and safety particularly?
Well, good question. And this might be where I get slightly ranty. So a couple of things. So probably the first thing is obviously leaders have a really important role to play in all aspects of workplace mental health. And I think that if you're a leader, whether you realize it or not, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I really don't think that there is an in-between there. So that probably does sound quite ranty, but I do genuinely believe that most leaders do want to do the right thing, and that really it's about potentially lack of capacity or lack of knowledge that might be, or just lack of tools for them to be able to put some of these things into place. So firstly, leaders are very, very important. I also think it is very much about the small things that leaders do every day that really matters. So there is one of the themes that's been coming out of the book is the need for leaders to be more, or bring more of that compassionate and that human side of leadership to the fore. I think that's something that actually is coming through a bit more now with COVID. You know, we've got the random babies and cats that appear on screens that probably are humanizing leaders a little bit and opening up conversations that perhaps weren't being had before. Maybe leaders are able to be a bit more vulnerable. But I do think that as we move forward post-pandemic and into the future of work, that those humanistic leadership skills are going to become increasingly important.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I guess that's one of the nice side benefits. There had to be a silver lining, Joelle, with the pandemic.
Sure.
And that is that, you know, mental health has come to the fore, and leaders are starting to realise that they actually do need to pay attention to that topic.
That's exactly how I start my book, funnily enough, is that I think that is the silver lining. But perhaps we're seeing it from the same perspective because we're passionate about the same topics. But it does seem that that it is top of the agenda now in Australia, in the UK, in the US.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing it around the world, even in places like Asia, where you'd think workplace mental health isn't as mature as maybe in, you know, the UK and Australia. Definitely more discussion around it and people wanting to do something in this area. Some of it is a bit misguided because, you know, people are kind of new, and also like you're talking about, you know, not understanding that maybe the most effective way to have impact in this space is to focus on root cause of work-related stress rather than symptoms. But at least there's, you know, there is more conversation, and hopefully with people like yourself and other experts like Tony who come on the podcast and through other channels, you know, talk about more systemic approaches to workplace mental health, then people start to get the idea.
And I don't think it's a nice to have anymore. You know, I work in talent and leadership now, and one of the things we're seeing, you've probably heard of the Great Resignation. A lot of people are talking about this at the moment, even more than the future of work, which I think this agenda also aligns to. But the expectation of talent is changing. I think it has been slowly changing for a number of years, but now the need for things like flexibility, to want to work in an environment with a supportive leader, to want to be able to maintain balance and a healthy workload are things that talent expects, and that talent will vote with their feet if they're not getting that, which is something that I think really does add to the business case. It's not just a fluffy topic. This is very much hardwired and should be hardwired into strategy and performance outcomes. Yeah,
and you should know that working in talent and what was the other part of your role? Talent and careers.
Talent, leadership and careers.
Yeah. I mean, people want a sense of progression right in their career, and they don't want to work, like you say, for a horrible boss and, you know, put into something that doesn't align to their values anymore. You know, they will vote with their feet, like you say.
Well, and it's also the, you know, the whole remote work and flexible work, you know, globally, we've been doing an experiment for the last, you know, getting on to 2 years now about whether or not it's feasible. Results are that for most organizations, it is feasible. So that old excuse of, oh, no, it won't work and we can't do it and people won't be productive, that's been disproven. So I think that, you know, for organizations to try to push to a revert back to the old way of working, it's going to be a very, very hard sell for a lot of organizations.
I completely agree. But it does, the remote working does throw up new types of challenges as well. So particularly if we come back to that idea of more human leadership, one of the things I do worry about is oftentimes in a workplace where you can really tune into your team is when you're having those conversations between meetings. They're not usually had in the meeting. They might be when you walk into the meeting, when you bump into them, and you kind of get a sense of how they are. And there's something that happens in that exchange that's not verbal. And I do worry that if we're not careful, we are missing that dialogue, the dialogue that's not actually dialogue, when you're picking up on some of those more micro emotions and expressions. So I'm not sure when we're doing that now. And I think it does mean that leaders do need to go above and beyond to really ask the question of their people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, that's an emerging challenge. With any new way of doing things, there's new challenges that come up from that as well. So I guess that's going to be something that will be, worked on and tackled as we move forward. So what are some of the other leadership barriers then that you think are significant as far as psychological health and safety goes?
So I literally just finished writing a chapter on this topic. So super top of mind. So I think whenever we talk about what is the problem, what is the solution for psych health and safety, leadership and middle management come up a lot. I think we have to be really careful not to overload leaders and managers though, because one of my worries, again, is that middle management, if you think about it, are some of the most overloaded and at capacity people usually within an organisation. They're often referred to as the meat in a sandwich, but also they're often at a life stage where there is a lot of stress and things happening to them in their personal lives as well. So they might be taking on bigger mortgages, they might be dealing with family responsibilities, or, I don't know how people have coped with homeschooling. I genuinely have so much respect for the mums and dads who've had to do that. And so I do think that if you think about the brain only has finite capacity to be able to take new ideas on. And when we're stressed, we tend to really narrow our perception and we're not able to take on innovation. We potentially aren't able to think as strategically or as long-term. And as you would know, the solution around workplace mental health is not a reactive one. It's not a quick fix. It is one that requires us to dedicate cognitive resources of the humankind as well as organizational resources. And so I do worry that if we put all of the onus on leaders individually, we may be asking too much, which also I think is a reason why we should be investing in leader wellbeing, because I know we talk a lot about how individual strategies aren't as good as organizational one, and I've been very much on that bandwagon, but there is a place for individually focused strategies and we shouldn't forget them. The idea of the systems approach to job stress is obviously that you're intervening at multiple levels. So organizational and individual, not organizational or individual. The danger is, of course, when you implement individual strategies, hoping for an organizational outcome. So I think leaders are one group that we should really be focusing on in terms of their mental health and freeing up that capacity, but also because they are obviously part of the solution. So that would be one of the barriers. The other one I think is that I talked a bit earlier about the stigma associated with stress. I still do think there are some really prevalent views out there in workplaces that stress is a problem for individuals. So if you're stressed and you're not coping, that is actually about you. Quite often in the people I speak to who've had a workplace mental health problem, we tend to overemphasize all of the factors that were happening to them outside of work. And we actually really underplay the work-based causes. Even the individuals themselves talk this way. I was going through a divorce, or, my dad was sick. There are things that are happening. And we often don't acknowledge that work was a part of that. Because I think the expectation is it's okay for work to consume all of your resources. And if you then can't cope with what's happening outside of work, then that is on you. But I think that we need to actually free up some of those resources and start to tackle some of those misconceptions about the cause and solutions for stress.
Yeah, excellent points there. I think, that sometimes we forget that leaders are also employees.
And humans.
Yes, and they're equally deserving of protection from psychosocial hazards. So, yeah, it's important that we don't just load up, especially those middle managers who are sort of the, between the rock and the hard place. They need those supports as well. Yeah.
Yep. And I think what we're asking of middle managers should be different to what we're asking of leaders. I think for leaders, what can be really, really powerful is their role modeling and setting the expectation and the tone for the organisation around what behaviours are acceptable and what aren't. Although I don't think storytelling is an endpoint in and of itself, I do think from a culture perspective, it can be so powerful in giving people permission to be human at work, which is a phrase I use quite a lot, permission to be human, mostly to myself when I'm being a bit hard on myself. It's, we are human ultimately, but also they obviously are responsible for a lot of the work practices and systems that often get in the way of mental health. And they set the priorities, and often far too many of them.
Yeah, we've spoken at length, I think, on this podcast about both the shared responsibility for workplace mental health. It's not just a systemic thing. It's not just an individual thing. You really have to be doing both. And also the important role of line managers. Like you say, they're the ones who are most immediately responsible or can influence the psychosocial hazards in their work team. When you think about things like, leadership style, work demands, role clarity, these are all things that could be influenced just at that line manager level, right? It doesn't need to be done at a global level.
To an extent, I think that's right. But yeah, I think broadly, I think that's right. And then they can really protect employees from many of the things that are happening in the organization. But in a really dysfunctional, toxic organization where people have too many things to do, processes are confusing or unwieldy, there's incivility and relationship breakdowns, I think there is a limit then to what the immediate leader can do, which is when we really need senior leaders to step up.
Yeah, and they definitely need the support from other functions like HR and OD and health and safety and, the rest as well. So we've seen some relatively, or what seems at least on the surface to be quick fixes to workplace mental health on channels like LinkedIn. So the week off has seemed to be quite a popular way to deal with burnout. However, we've got some doubts about how sustainable a benefit that will have for people's mental health. Nice to have a break, but what are people coming back to? So what do you think is required from leaders specifically to drive sustainable change to workplace mental health?
Again, good question. So before I answer that question, I want to comment on your point you made about the week off. I don't know if you've seen some of the research that's come out of Europe about effort recovery, which is a fascinating area of study, which actually shows that it's less about taking those big chunks of time off to recover from stress. Obviously, that's is helpful from a psychological, physiological recovery perspective. But probably not surprisingly, as you were alluding to, as soon as that person returns to the workplace, it can take sometimes a matter of minutes or hours for that stress to be back. So they actually find that daily recovery activities is critical. So what it is that you're doing in what Adam Fraser calls the third space, so the space between work and home, what you actually do in that space, which may actually be, for Victorians, the distance between your living room and, the kitchen.
Got to be a quick routine.
Yeah. Even doing things like having a shower after work does create that kind of like full stop or that bookend for your day. Or it might be going for a bike ride. I remember when I was working with the police, I was talking to a police officer about what he does to manage stress. And he recounted the story of coming home one day to find that his wife had locked the door and just put in front of the door his bike and just left a little note saying, go for a ride, take half an hour, go do what you need to do. And then when you come back, we're here with open arms. And that for him was that realization that we often do I think it's called the kick the cat phenomenon, where at work we keep it all inside and then we get home and we just let it all hang out, if you like. And often it's the people we love that bear the brunt of that. But that is a really good example of effort recovery, which is an activity that helps to create that distance between the work stress, stops you from ruminating about work, might emotionally or physiologically put you into a different state. And then you're able to re-enter the next space, which is the home space in a more recovered state.
Yeah, I think that's
not your question, but
no. But I think on that, I think that's actually really good advice for people. But also it kind of ties into probably your previous research in positive psychology and PPIs or positive psychology interventions. It's not about the duration of the activity and a really high intensity activity. It's about the frequency of those behaviors. It's kind of like your physical health, right? You can't just go for a 100-kilometer run once a year and be physically fit. You have to do it, frequently. Same with things like, acts of kindness or practicing gratitude. You don't just do it as a 1 week thing and then forget about it. Like you said in your research around strengths-based leadership, you saw the positive benefits of the intervention diminish over time because it wasn't actually, the practice wasn't continued. So with anything, it's not just like a 1 week off and then we've solved all of our issues. It's like, what are we doing regularly? And like you say, what can you build into your daily routine that kind of provides that replenishment?
Yep. I do genuinely believe that it's the small things that we do every day that make the biggest difference. And you can apply that to your own mental health. You can apply that to being a leader. I think it stands equally well. But back to your original question around what leaders can do to really drive change. One is, I think I've already mentioned about the role modeling and the storytelling. So, and I don't think this has to be a senior leader coming forward and doing the big reveal around their own mental health or mental illness. I think even just making it okay for people to actually talk about mental health by referring to it frequently and asking questions about it. I know in my own team meetings every week, I tend to ask my team not just how they're feeling, but how they're tracking in terms of capacity and workload. And I, being a pragmatic, do ask them to give me a score out of 10. For some of them, I know that I need to add an extra one or two.
Do you put that into Excel spreadsheets as well?
I have been tracking it. I've been tracking that. No, I do quite like a spreadsheet, I must admit. But I find that does really open up conversations about workload. So not just asking them if they're stressed, but asking them about the causes of stress as well and what I can do differently. I think that also leaders need to be asking questions about, to that point, about the sources of stress. So I think quite easily we can, as you say, go for the quick fixes, but we know that what is required is to think much more deeply and in a more considered way about things like workload, like how we're prioritizing work, like systems of work that are causing people to be stressed, and to actually put time and effort into addressing those things. And I think we need to be very conscious as leaders about designing good work. So there's been a lot of talk about the future of work. Sometimes that is talked about, things like automation are talked about in a way that might be perceived as negative for mental health. But I like to think of it, if you were to flip that on its head, how can we as senior leaders think about automating some of the jobs that are really lacking meaning for people, that are really annoying, difficult things that they do every day that is not a good use of their skills, and then replacing that with work that actually is good work that actually does give them a sense of meaning where they can use their knowledge and skills. But again, these are big things. I think more on a daily level, if you're a leader, it's about asking the questions, making time for people, being present, creating space for these discussions, listening without judgment, are all of those more micro leadership skills that I think can't be discounted.
Yeah, and I think there's a real competence gap, right? And through no fault of the line manager, they just haven't been trained or given, like you say, the space in many instances to actually be able to get these skills, or have health and safety or HR kind of guide them and mentor them in this area. Yeah, we
need to make it more practical. I mean, I think, and I say this as one of the authors of the integrated approach, I think that we were right in saying that it needs to be comprehensive. But I think where we still haven't done what we need to do is make it really, really simple. And I think sometimes you don't want it to be simple to the point where you haven't considered the complexity. We need to find the simplicity that lies beyond complexity, where we take the complexity and distill it down into 3, 4, 5 things that leaders can do, and make it really much easier for them to build that into how they work and not be seen as something that's done in addition to their job.
Yeah, we've got some ideas on that. I have to share that with you later, Kat. But I think one of the things that you mentioned around that informal discussion, finding out, how people are traveling, but more importantly, what's contributing to them, feeling a certain way. I think that's really important, and it can be done quite informally. You don't need to wait for the annual employee engagement survey to roll out and get some data about your team. Just checking in with people once a week, even once a month, deciding on, what's working well, what's not at a, even at a work design level, I think would be really beneficial. But obviously there's just that competence gap and, capability gap.
And just asking your people, how can I help?
Yeah.
Not here's what I think the solution is, but how do you think that I can help?
Yeah. It's all part of consultation, right? If we think about risk management, don't come up with a solution yourself. Actually ask people, okay, well, let's describe the problem and come up with a solution together. Yeah.
And a much less confrontational or difficult conversation, I guess, from a leader's perspective, to talk about work rather than to talk about mental health.
Yeah.
Yes,
so,
that's a good point.
Given everything that we've talked about here, if you could provide a roadmap for organisations who are starting out in psych health and safety, what would that look like?
Well, I would love to design a roadmap, by the way. And I have actually at one point in my career started doing that. But my answer to this is I have both, I guess, the right answer, if you like, which is the best practice answer. And then I have the more, what I think is perhaps the more pragmatic answer. So I think the right answer, if you will, the best practice approach would be that you need to approach these things the same way that you would any other strategic business initiative. So by creating the case for change, enrolling leaders, winning hearts and minds, long-range planning, collecting data, using a tool like your tool to actually understand what are some of the stresses and how do we mitigate that. And then through consultation, implementing those strategies over time. So that, I think, is the right approach, if you like. But in my experience, very few leaders or people who are starting out in this space have the level of appetite or groundswell in their organization to just launch in like that. And there's a whole bunch of micro interventions that need to happen beforehand, which is about building readiness. So when I was interviewing leaders in this space, I almost always found that people would start with something like a resilience seminar, mindfulness, mental health first aid. These are all things I've heard you talk about, and they aren't not right things to do. I think what's good about those activities and why most organizations probably do need to start there is it actually does start to build some appetite for workplace mental health. You can't really skip steps. So even if you know what the right thing to do is to kind of launch in at more of a gold standard level 4 maturity level, I don't think the organization is necessarily ready for that. So you almost need to go through these steps through a maturity process, which actually helps you to create the scaffolding that you can then build on to do the kind of strategic long-term work that's probably required in this space. So if you are listening and you are doing those kind of activities, I wouldn't discount them. I just wouldn't stop there. Alongside doing that, it is important to be building that business case, finding that very senior, ideally executive leader or board member who's going to really champion these efforts. But you kind of need to go slow before you can go fast. And I think that's okay. So I don't think we should be necessarily judging people for doing a mindfulness program. I practice mindfulness, by the way, and I'm also a yoga instructor. That doesn't mean that I would recommend that's the only intervention, but it might be the way that you get that dialogue started in an organization. And it's step one of what you know in your head is a 10-step, 20-step plan, but it might be, I think they're important stepping stones, but just don't stop there.
Yeah, I think that the idea of readiness and maturity is so important. And it's the case for introducing any sort of organizational change. We might have a good understanding of where we see that the organization should be, but we can only intervene where the organization is right now and help them to take the next step that's going to get them ultimately to where they need to be. So I think that, it's good to have that ultimate goal about where you want to be, but it's also about saying, well, where are we now and what's the first step? And then what's the next step? Yeah. Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about it in that way, Kat, because we've been having the exact same conversation internally for the last month, going, well, we really want to get companies to that point in time where they're doing psych health and safety really well. And it's embedded in their safety management system and all the rest. So like you say, that gold level 4 maturity level, but we know that some people are only just starting to talk about mental health as well. And now we're branching into other parts of the world, like Asia, for example, where the maturity level is, even lower again. So it's like, well, how do we actually help them to take those steps from when they're first got an interest in mental health and wanting to do something, and dealing with like just language and stigma and that sort of thing. So how do we go from that level all the way up to that? And so that's kind of like our newer approach when we talk to, potential clients, like, where are you at, and where would the product that we're building actually help you to kind of like go along that maturity journey to get to that gold standard in the end. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I built this maturity model in my head and a little bit on paper over 15 years of working in this space. And I think when I was in academia, if I look back now, I have a saying that if you're not embarrassed by who you were last year, then you're probably not growing. So looking back 10 years, I'm very embarrassed. But I think I was so idealistic then when I first started working in this space, and I thought that organizations should be doing this simply out of a duty of care and because it was the right thing to do. Now, I still do believe that it is the right thing to do, but I think what I've been learning and got a lot better at through working at places like Deloitte is that the businesses have very different commercial realities, and you need to be able to talk the language of that organization and really, really get it, and really understand the business requirements and some of those barriers. And to your point, Joelle, sound organizational change principles, because it's not that simple. It really is not that simple at all.
Yeah. Now, there was a time when, if companies didn't want to, do more systemic psych health and safety type interventions, that, would say, well, probably there's not a good fit for us and you then. But now we're recognizing, well, we can actually provide value at an earlier stage and help them to progress through that maturity curve if we start working with them at that early stage, rather than maybe just going with a mindfulness kind of program, and that's the only thing that they get into, and there's no opportunity for them to progress down that maturity curve. We're probably better guiding them along that journey.
Absolutely agree. I'm really glad that you're taking on those organizations as well.
Yeah. So you've obviously been doing this for a while, Kat, despite your youthful appearance, and you know your stuff. You've been working across, like you say, academic, the consulting, the internal consulting as well. You've seen quite a bit over the last 10 to 20 years. But if you were to look into the future, what would be some of your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Oh, this is when we get a bit aspirational, which is exciting. I think in the longer term, I would really love to see the trajectory that we go on with workplace mental health being something similar to, in some ways, I look at the journey that inclusion and diversity has been on. And I do think in Australia, at least, and potentially in the US, they are on a faster curve than we are, where they actually are talking about things like inclusion as a strategic priority, and boards are actually talking about it. I think that is the ultimate indicator of progress, would be that the chairman of the board is asking the CEO, if they have a board, for evidence to suggest that they're taking an integrated approach. That would be, for me, what I've learned is what the board asks is what the organisation will do. So how do we actually do that? That would be my absolute aspiration, because I think if you've got buy-in at that level, the rest of it does start to come through. It's really hard to actually push it up to the board. It's very easy to come down from the board. More short term than that, I think, coming back to my point earlier, is I hope that academics and practitioners and people like yourselves in this space do work out ways to take the complex and make it simple. Maybe we call it simplex. But because there's a lot of complexity out there, and I don't think you can skip the complexity, because then it's just, if it's too simple, it's just probably not quite right. But I do think that quite often we stop at the point of complexity and just leave it there. And then organizations are looking at what academics do, including work that I've done myself, and go, this is just too hard. Like, you have no idea what it's actually like. We need to distill it down. And that doesn't necessarily mean dumbing it down. A lot of very good cognitive, intellectual thinking needs to go into making the complex simple.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of really good goals. Having worked in capacity, in a governance capacity, on a couple of boards myself, yeah, I've definitely seen that link between governance and operations. And if you're pushing down, it's Yeah, they tend to do what you ask, and they find out ways to do that, that meet your needs as a board. But yeah, like you say, I don't know if I like the word simplex. I think you should keep working on that one.
Yep, that's fine. Happy to receive some feedback.
But I totally agree. You don't need to dumb down good ideas, but to make them more transferable, so they can actually be taken on board in real life, rather than just sitting in some journal that's behind a paywall somewhere that no one's going to read. I think that's really important. And hopefully people like yourselves and ourselves can continue to bridge that gap.
Yeah, that paywall issue is a whole separate rant, isn't it? It's one of my pet peeves. But let's not go down that path right now. So, Kat, do you have some words of advice for our listeners who are sort of considering maybe a move into the psych health and safety field of work?
I would say, do it! ! I think there's never been a better time than right now to make that move. It is such an exciting and growing area. And as someone who has worked in this place or in this space for a long time, I've never seen such excitement and such dialogue and so many innovations, including your innovation, that are popping up in this space. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is that there isn't just one path into this space. So obviously I'm a psychologist, but you've got epidemiologists working in this space. You've got OH&S people, management people, HR people. It isn't that hard to get your head around what best practice looks like. So there are multiple ways into it. And the third thing I would say is to not give up. It is an area that is, I found, quite hard to really get change to happen. And it can be frustrating, which is probably why I took a step out of the profession a while ago. It can be really hard work. And so you do need to actually surround yourself with people who are really passionate about it to help keep that passion alive, I think, because it's not always easy. So I think, they'd probably be my three pieces of advice. Oh, sorry, if I can add a fourth, would be to be commercial. So as I mentioned before, coming in idealistically and being really passionate about the topic is not enough. I think it actually is helpful, very helpful, but it's not enough. I think we need to be much more commercial and to actually be like a secret agent going into organizations, which is perhaps how you could describe my career, to actually understand how they really work, because they're very complex commercial places. And unless we know how to speak that dialogue or that particular dialect, I don't think we can be as effective at advocating and influencing from the outside.
Some very sage advice there, Kat. Thank you. And I'm sure that our listeners will take a lot away from our whole chat today. It's been fascinating.
Well, it's been really, really enjoyable speaking to you about these things.
Yeah, Kat, so that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you on behalf of Joelle and myself and all the listeners, no doubt, who are going to take a lot away from this episode. Thank you so much for coming on board and sharing so much from your expertise.
Yeah, my pleasure. And come find me on LinkedIn. I do like hearing from people who are working in this space, and always happy to offer advice if useful, but also just to surround myself with other people who are passionate about this topic as well.
Yeah, terrific to hear. I think you are very much like a lot of our previous guests, in that they like to surround themselves with like-minded professionals who want to advance, I guess, the practice. So Thank you very much for that offer. I'm sure some of our listeners will take you up on that. So that brings us to the end of the episode, listeners. Don't forget that we video these episodes over Zoom. So we will put that on the Flourish GX YouTube channel, so you can check it out on YouTube if you prefer to take in the podcast that way. If you are on LinkedIn, as Kat was mentioning before, you'll find on the Flourish GX LinkedIn page that we do share clips from the episode. So no doubt there'll be a couple that will show up from this episode on there very shortly. Also, while you're on LinkedIn, you can connect with Joelle and myself, who also like to surround ourselves with like-minded professionals and continue the conversation through that channel. So thanks again, listeners, and we'll catch you next episode.